In the spring of 1496, somewhere in the Alpine foothills of Styria, a Jewish family is packing everything they own into wooden carts. They have lived in this town for 4 generations. Their great-grandfather helped build the synagogue. Their grandmother is buried in the cemetery on the hill. But none of that matters anymore. An imperial decree has arrived from Emperor Maximilian I. The Jews of Styria and Carinthia have 6 months to leave. Not because of anything they did, not because of any crime, but because the provincial estates offered the emperor 42,000 florins to make them disappear. This is the story of how an emperor sold an entire people, how local politicians bought ethnic cleansing as a budget line item, and how communities that had flourished for 400 years were erased in a single year by leaving behind only street names, foundation stones, and a ban that would last for nearly 4 centuries. But here's what makes this story different from the usual tale of medieval persecution. This wasn't about religion. The emperor didn't believe the accusations in his own decree. And the people who wanted the Jews gone weren't peasants with pitchforks. They were nobles, clergy, and merchants who owed the Jews money and saw a way to make their debts disappear, along with their creditors. This is the story of the 1496 expulsion. And it starts not with hatred, but with bankruptcy. The year is 1493. Frederick III, Holy Roman Emperor, has just died in Linz at the age of 77. He had ruled for 53 years, longer than any emperor before him, and he leaves behind a mess. His son Maximilian inherits a realm that looks impressive on paper. Austria, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, Tyrol. For the first time since 1379, when the Treaty of Neuburg split the Habsburg dynasty into competing branches, one man controls all the Austrian hereditary lands. But Maximilian also inherits something else: debt. Staggering, crushing, impossible debt. You have to understand the scale of the problem. The Holy Roman Empire produced maybe 20,000 gulden per year in revenue for its emperor. The King of France, meanwhile, was collecting between 4 and 6 million gulden annually. The French had a centralized tax system. Maximilian had to beg provincial assemblies for every penny. The Italians had a nickname for him. They called him Massimiliano di Pochi Denari, Maximilian the Moneyless. The French were even crueler. They called him the Mayor of Augsburg, because he spent so much time groveling to the banking families there. And Maximilian was always at war. Always. The Burgundian inheritance conflict with France had consumed resources since 1477. The Italian wars were just getting started in 1494. The Ottoman Empire was pressing against the borders, with Turkish raiding parties penetrating into Styria and Carinthia. Roughly 70% of everything Maximilian earned went straight to funding armies. So where does a bankrupt emperor turn when he needs cash? In the 15th century, you had 2 options. You could borrow from bankers, or you could squeeze your subjects. Maximilian did both, and he did both brilliantly. If you define brilliance as finding ways to extract money from anyone and everyone. His primary creditors were the Fuggers of Augsburg. Jakob Fugger, who would eventually become the richest man in European history, first met Maximilian in 1489. When Maximilian took over Tyrol from his incompetent cousin Archduke Sigismund in 1490, he inherited massive debts already owed to the Fuggers. His solution was to pledge future revenues: mining concessions in the silver mines at Schwaz, mining rights in Carinthia. Anything that could be mortgaged, he mortgaged. But bankers only lend when they expect repayment. And Maximilian's other source of funds was far more complicated: the provincial estates. Every Habsburg territory had its own assembly, its Landtag, composed of nobility, clergy, and representatives from the larger towns. These estates controlled tax grants. If Maximilian wanted money for Ottoman defense or Italian adventures, he had to negotiate, and the estates knew their power. At the imperial diet at Worms in 1495, the German princes had humiliated Maximilian, refusing to strengthen central authority. By 1500, they would actually consider deposing him. The man who ruled on paper was perpetually at the mercy of the men who controlled the purse strings. So when the estates of Styria and Carinthia came to Maximilian with a proposal, he was in no position to refuse. The proposal was simple. They would pay him 42,000 florins. In exchange, he would expel every Jew from their territories. This wasn't a new idea. The estates had been demanding Jewish expulsion for decades. Under Frederick III, they had concluded that only expulsion could solve what they called the Jewish question. But Frederick had refused. He may have been weak in many ways, but he maintained a consistent policy of protecting Jews in his territories. The Turks were raiding the borders, but as long as Frederick lived, the Jews were safe. Frederick died on August 19, 1493. Everything changed. To understand why the estates wanted the Jews gone so badly, we need to go back, way back, 4 centuries, in fact, to when Jews first arrived in these alpine lands. The earliest evidence of Jewish presence in Styria comes from the town of Judenburg. The name literally means Jews' Borough. It appears in a document from 1075, a staple right deed that refers to the place as Mercatum Judenburg. Jewish traders had established it as a commercial outpost on the Moor Valley route connecting the Danube region to the Adriatic. Think about that for a moment. A town named after its Jewish founders, its Jewish identity written into its very name. The coat of arms of Judenburg still depicts a head wearing a Jewish hat. The evidence of that founding community is literally built into the heraldry. In Carinthia, the evidence is equally old. Fulkermarkt appears as Forum Judiorum, the market of the Jews, around 1105. A Judendorf near Friesack is documented by 1124, and the oldest Jewish gravestone in the entire Danube region belongs to a man named Shabbatai Haparnas, murdered in 1129 or 1130. His stone was found in Fulkermarkt and sits today in the Klagenfurt Landesmuseum. By the 14th and 15th centuries, these scattered settlements had grown into organized communities with all the institutions of Jewish life: synagogues, ritual baths, cemeteries, rabbinic courts, schools. Graz, the capital of Styria, had approximately 200 Jews around 1400. They built 2 successive synagogues, the first in the old Judengasse until 1438, the second from 1447 in the Herrengasse, directly across from the Dominican monastery. They maintained a mikveh for ritual purification and a cemetery. The oldest surviving tombstone, belonging to a woman named Zipporah from 1304, is displayed in the modern Graz synagogue, a silent witness to 7 centuries of presence and absence. Judenburg, at its early 15th century peak, was even more impressive. The record showed 22 Jewish wholesale dealers, each with fortunes exceeding 100,000 gulden, plus 38 other wealthy merchants, the majority of them Jewish. This was serious money. This was a commercial powerhouse. And then there was Maribor. Maribor, which the Germans called Marburg, sat on the Drava River in Lower Styria. Its Jewish quarter contained everything a community needed. A synagogue first documented in 1354 with an Aron HaKodesh facing Jerusalem, a Ner Tamid, a menorah, a bima. The building still stands today, one of the oldest preserved synagogues in Europe. But here's a detail that stopped me when I found it in the records. The Maribor synagogue had 3 or 4 seats permanently reserved for Christian guests, regular seats, set aside specifically so that Christians could come and observe Jewish worship. Think about what that means. This wasn't a community hiding behind walls. This wasn't a ghetto of fear and separation. This was a community confident enough in its place to invite its neighbors in, to share its sacred spaces, to build bridges across religious lines. Maribor also maintained a Talmudic school, a rabbinical residence, a mikveh along the Drava River, and a Jewish cemetery. In 1465, the community built a fortified tower, the Żydowski Stolp, the Jewish Tower, to defend the quarter. You don't build fortifications unless you have something worth defending, and you don't invest in defense unless you plan to stay. In Corinthia, the communities were smaller, but equally established. Friesach served as the regional cemetery center from at least 1255, with Jews from surrounding areas bringing their dead there for burial. Klagenfurt had 36 Jewish taxpayers listed in 1335, with a Jewish quarter outside a city gate and a Judengasse that would retain its name until 1829, 3 centuries after the last Jew was forced to leave. Villach, the commercial center of Corinthia under the Bishop of Bamberg's jurisdiction, also had its own synagogue and cemetery near the village of Judendorf, another Jewish village name, another reminder of who built these places. The legal framework protecting these communities rested on ducal privileges. Duke Friedrich's privilege of July 1, 1244, King Ottokar I's privilege of March 29, 1254, a charter from June 24, 1377, issued by Dukes Albrecht III and Leopold III, confirming the right, liberty, grace, and good habits of Corinthian and Styrian Jews, renewed in 1396. In 1451, Pope Nicholas V issued a bull expressly permitting Emperor Frederick III to allow Jews in all his dominions. This wasn't routine. The Pope felt compelled to issue this permission because of a specific threat. A Franciscan preacher named John of Capistrano, who had arrived in Vienna that same year and was stirring up anti-Jewish sentiment wherever he went. Frederick kept the bull as a kind of insurance policy. As long as he lived, the protection held. But insurance policies don't survive the policyholder. Of all the people in this story, one stands above the rest. Rabbi Iserline ben Patakia, born in Regensburg around 1390, was the greatest rabbinic authority in German-speaking lands during the 15th century. His life traces the arc of Jewish fate in these territories. In 1421, when Iserline was about 30 years old, catastrophe struck. Duke Albrecht V of Austria ordered all Jews in his territories arrested. Iserline's uncle, Aaron Blumlein, and his mother were among those killed in what came to be called the Vienna Gesera, the Vienna Decree. The persecution was comprehensive. On May 23, 1420, every Jew in Austria was arrested, their possessions confiscated. The poorer Jews were loaded onto boats without oars or rudders and set adrift on the Danube. Children were forcibly taken from their parents and placed in monasteries. The wealthy were held for ransom. Between 160 and 300 Jews who had barricaded themselves in the Orserua synagogue at Vienna's Judenplatz chose collective suicide rather than face conversion or death at Christian hands. Rabbi Jonah set the synagogue ablaze. On March 12, 1421, the approximately 210 remaining Jews, 92 men, and 120 women were burned alive at the Gänseweide in Erdberg. In rabbinic literature, Vienna became known as Ir Hadamim, the city of blood. Austria itself was called Blood Country. Israel Iserline fled south. He made his way to Maribor, where the synagogue would become the seat of the Supreme Rabbinate of Styria, Corinthia, and Carniola. For the next several decades, this refugee from Vienna's slaughter would make Maribor one of the most important centers of Jewish learning in Central Europe. His major work, Terumat Hadashen, contains 354 responsa, answers to legal questions sent to him from communities across the region. It became a foundational text of Jewish law, influential enough that Moses Isserles would use it as one of his primary sources when writing the Hamappa, his glosses on the Shulchan Aruch that established Ashkenazi practice. But Iserline's importance goes beyond his legal rulings. His student Joseph ben Moses compiled a work called Leket Yosher, which documented not just Iserline's legal opinions, but his daily behavior. What he ate, how he conducted himself, how he interacted with Christians and with his own community. This is invaluable material. Most medieval rabbis survive only as names attached to legal texts. Iserline survives as a person, observed and recorded by someone who lived with him. One detail from Leket Yosher stands out. Iserline, we are told, in many matters inclined toward leniency, particularly in order to establish harmonious relations with the Christians. This was not a rabbi building walls. This was a rabbi building bridges, seeking accommodation, trying to make Jewish life sustainable in a Christian world. Around 1445, Iserline returned to Wiener Neustadt and spent the rest of his life there, dying in 1460. He never saw the destruction that would come 36 years later, but his students did, and the communities he had led. The schools he had built, the traditions he had established, all of it would be swept away in the decree of 1496. But if these communities were so established, so prosperous, so intertwined with Christian society, why did the estates want them gone? The answer lies in money, specifically in debt. Here's the situation in 15th century Austria. The church prohibited Christians from lending money at interest. Canon law was clear on this point. Usury was a mortal sin. A Christian who lent money and charged interest was risking his immortal soul. But economies don't run without credit. Nobles needed cash to equip soldiers. Merchants needed capital to fund trading ventures. Peasants needed loans to survive bad harvests. Clergy needed financing for building projects. Jews had no prohibition on lending to non-Jews. And because they were barred from most other occupations, barred from joining guilds, barred from owning agricultural land, barred from practicing most crafts, money lending became one of the few economic niches available to them. This wasn't a choice. It was a trap. The same society that forced Jews into money lending then blamed them for the consequences of money lending. And the consequences were real. Interest rates in medieval lending typically ran between 30 and 43% annually. That sounds outrageous until you understand the risks. A ruler could cancel debts at will. A mob could destroy everything you owned. An expulsion decree could arrive without warning. Lenders had no legal recourse if borrowers defaulted. They couldn't seize land as collateral. They couldn't take cases to civil courts. Under those conditions, high interest rates weren't greed. They were survival math. If you expected to lose a significant portion of your loans to default, cancellation, or violence, you had to charge enough on the remaining loans to stay solvent. But try explaining risk premiums to a nobleman who owes you money. Try explaining actuarial calculations to a merchant watching his interest payments compound. What they saw was a Jew getting rich off Christian misery. What they felt was resentment. The estates of Styria and Carinthia were full of people who owed money to Jews, nobles who had borrowed to fund military service, town officials who had taken loans for municipal projects, even clergy who had financed construction or covered shortfalls. An expulsion offered something almost magical. It made the creditors disappear. The debts didn't exactly vanish. There would be commissions to settle accounts, but the political dynamics shifted entirely. With the Jewish creditors gone, with their property confiscated, with their legal standing erased, the debtors found themselves in a much stronger position. The 1451 Church Synod of Bamberg had demanded total abolition of interest and threatened interdict against communities that tolerated Jewish usury. This gave religious cover to economic motives. You weren't driving out Jews because you owed them money. You were purifying your community of a sinful practice. The hypocrisy was complete. Christians created the conditions that forced Jews into lending. Christians borrowed the money they needed from Jewish lenders. Christians then blamed Jews for the lending that Christians had made necessary. And Christians used religious law to justify eliminating the creditors they had created. But economic resentment alone doesn't produce expulsion decrees. You need something else. You need stories. You need accusations so horrifying that they transform neighbors into monsters, creditors into enemies, fellow subjects into existential threats. Medieval Europe had developed a remarkable technology for this purpose: the blood libel. The accusation was always the same. Jews kidnapped Christian children, murdered them, and used their blood in religious rituals. Sometimes the blood went into Passover matzah. Sometimes it was used for circumcision ceremonies. Sometimes it served magical purposes. The details varied, but the core accusation remained constant. There was, of course, not a shred of evidence for any of it. But Jewish law prohibits the consumption of blood in the strongest possible terms. The very idea of using human blood in religious ritual is abhorrent to everything in Jewish tradition. Popes had issued bulls declaring the accusations false. Emperors had denounced them as fabrications. None of this mattered. The stories were too useful. The Pulkow Massacre of 1338 established the template for the Austrian territories. On Easter Sunday, April 12, 1338, someone allegedly found a bleeding host in front of a Jew's house in Pulkow, Lower Austria. The accusation was host desecration, the claim that Jews stabbed consecrated communion wafers to torture Christ's body. Within 11 days, the mob had burned Jews at the stake and plundered their property. The violence spread to 27 localities across Upper Austria and Carinthia. In Wolfsburg, 70 Jews were burned at the stake in a single incident. The chronicler John of Viktring recorded what happened. Jews were despoiled of their treasures, drowned, burnt, beheaded, eviscerated. Whole families were destroyed, including children in their cribs. Evidence later emerged that a local cleric, short on cash, had fraudulently produced the bleeding host. It was a scam, a profitable scam, since the perpetrators got to keep whatever they stole from their victims. Similar fraud was uncovered in Korneberg in 1305, where the Bishop of Passau's investigation discovered that the local priest had fabricated the entire accusation. But by the time the truth emerged, the dead were dead, and the precedent was set. The most devastating Austrian persecution came in 1420 and 1421, the Vienna Gesera, the first mentioned earlier. But the event that shaped the 1496 expulsion occurred not in Austria but in Trent, just across the Alps in northern Italy. In March 1475, a Franciscan preacher named Bernardino de Feltre finished a series of inflammatory Lenten sermons in Trent. He had been preaching against Jews for weeks, warning of their danger, demanding their expulsion. On March 23rd, a 2-year-old boy named Simon went missing. His body was found in the cellar of a Jewish moneylender named Samuel. Prince Bishop Johannes Hinderbach presided over the investigation. All the Jewish men of Trent were arrested. Under torture, they confessed to murdering Simon for his blood. 15 were burned at the stake. Hinderbach was not content with local justice. He circulated accounts of the case throughout Austria, Germany, and Italy. He commissioned artwork depicting the alleged murder. Within a year, over 100 miracles were attributed to little Simon. In 1493, the Nuremberg Chronicle included a famous woodcut showing Jews draining blood from the child's body. The Trent affair occurred just 21 years before the 1496 expulsion. Its imagery, its accusations, its language shaped everything that followed. When Maximilian's decree accused Jews of having tortured and killed Christian children and used their blood for hidden damnable purposes, it was echoing Trent almost word for word. Emperor Frederick III had actually tried to intervene in the Trent case. He sent investigators, demanded fair proceedings, expressed skepticism about the confessions extracted under torture. For his trouble, he was nicknamed the King of the Jews by those who thought he was too soft on Jewish criminals. Frederick died in 1493. The same year, the Nuremberg Chronicle spread the Trent imagery across Europe. The same year, Maximilian took sole control of the Habsburg lands. Sometimes history's timing is too convenient to be coincidence. The negotiations that produced the 1496 expulsion unfolded across 3 critical assemblies. In April 1494, at a diet in Marburg, preliminary discussions began. Maximilian needed money for Ottoman defense. The estates needed something in return. A second diet at Marburg in November 1494 advanced the negotiations. The shape of a deal was emerging. Money for defense, Jews for the money. Then came the decisive assembly. On August 28, 1495, at the Styrian Landtag in Graz, the deal was sealed. The estates agreed to pay for the expulsion of all Jews from Styria, Wiener Neustadt, and Neunkirchen. By September 7, 1495, the agreement was formalized. The price was 38,000 pounds of Vienna pennies from Styria, an additional 4,000 Rhenish florins from Carinthia. Combined, roughly 42,000 florins. Look at those numbers. The Styrian contribution was nearly 10 times the Corinthian payment. This suggests the Styrian Jewish population was far larger, far more economically significant. The estates were pricing the expulsion based on what they were getting rid of. And what were they getting? They were getting debt relief. They were getting the elimination of competition. They were getting confiscated property. They were getting a scapegoat for economic anxieties. They were getting all of this for a one-time payment that would be spread across thousands of taxpayers. For the emperor, the calculation was simpler. He was getting 42,000 florins in cash at a moment when he desperately needed money for the Italian wars. In July 1496, even as the expulsion decrees were being issued, Maximilian was besieging the Florentine city of Livorno. He would withdraw in September due to supply shortages. The cash from the estates would help fund the next campaign. This was the genius, if you can call it that, of the arrangement. The emperor got immediate payment. The estates got a permanent solution to their Jewish problem. The only losers were people who had no voice in the negotiation, no representation in the estates, no advocate at court now that Frederick was dead. The formal decrees were issued from Schwäbisch Firth. The Carinthia decree on March 9, 1496. The Styria decree on March 12, 1496. Jews were given 6 months to leave Carinthia. Those in Styria had until Epiphany, January 6, 1497, approximately 9 months to liquidate everything their families had built over 4 centuries. The decree was designated an immerwährende Ausweisung, a perpetual expulsion. It was meant to last forever. The stated justifications read like a greatest hits of anti-Semitic accusations. Jews had repeatedly insulted and desecrated the Holy Sacrament. They had tortured and killed Christian children and used their blood for hidden, damnable purposes. They had used falsified letters, seals, and otherwise to cheat people. They had impoverished and ruined many noble and other families. Modern historians who have studied this decree agree on a key point. Maximilian didn't believe any of it. The most comprehensive scholarly study of the expulsion, Johann Fühner's Kaiser Maximilian I und die Juden in den österreichischen Erblanden, published in 2007, makes this explicit. Maximilian was certainly no enemy of Jews from religious reasons and did not believe the terrible accusations that served as a pretext for the expulsions. His Jewish policy was erratic and motivated by financial considerations. Between 1494 and 1510, he authorized 13 expulsions in return for fiscal compensations from local governments. This wasn't ideology. This was business. The Jews were a revenue source. When local governments offered more money to remove them than the Jews themselves were paying in taxes, Maximilian sold. Now we come to the part of the story that rarely gets told: the execution. Decrees are words on paper. Execution is people being forced from their homes. These are different things. In mid-October 1496, Maximilian issued public notices ordering all subjects with debts to Jews to settle accounts. Think about this from a practical standpoint. You're expelling the creditors, but the loans they made are still outstanding. Someone owes money. Someone else is owed money. You can't just make the Jews disappear and pretend the financial relationships never existed. Or can you? The emperor established commissions to handle debt settlement. But by November 1496, he realized the process couldn't be completed on time. A plague had broken out in Styria. The commission couldn't assemble in Graz. Proceedings were suspended until April 24, 1497. And here's where something interesting happens. Maximilian ordered cities not to expel Jews during the winter months. He even required that Jews without lodging be provided shelter. Why would he care? Why would the man who signed the expulsion decree also require that the expelled be housed during winter. One possibility is basic humanity, some residual concern for the welfare of people he was destroying. Another possibility is more cynical. Dead Jews couldn't settle their debts. Dead Jews couldn't be properly squeezed for departure taxes and fees. If the expelled died of exposure before the commissions could process their cases, the Crown lost revenue. Whatever the reason, the departure stretched well beyond the original deadlines. By January 6, 1497, the Maribor community had been forced out, but some Jews were still departing in 1498, signing declarations that they would never return as they left. Those signatures are haunting documents, forced to renounce any future claim, any right of return, any connection to the places their families had lived for generations. Sign here, and your presence in this land is officially erased. Jewish property became Crown property. The synagogues were confiscated, some were demolished, others were converted. In Maribor, a local official named Bernardin Drucker acquired the synagogue. In 1501, he converted it into the Catholic Church of All Saints. The conversion required only minor modifications. Remove the bema, install an altar, change the symbols. The bones of the building were sound. Jewish masons had built well. That building survives today. It's a cultural center now, no longer a church, no longer a synagogue, but still standing, still carrying the memory of what was taken. The Maribor Jewish Cemetery passed to the Minoret order. In Neunkirchen, Maximilian donated 2 vacant Jewish houses and the synagogue to a religious brotherhood in 1504. In Graz, the former Jewish quarter was taken over by upper-class Christians who found themselves with nice properties at distressed prices. Jews departing were required to surrender pledges, the physical collateral they held for loans. This was pure confiscation. They were forfeiting valuable goods without necessarily recovering the debts those goods secured. The estates that owed money to Jewish creditors were primary beneficiaries. The expulsion functioned as massive coordinated debt relief. You owed money to someone, that someone was forced to leave. The commission handling the debts was staffed by people who had supported the expulsion. The outcome was predictable. Where did they go? The expelled Jews of Styria and Carinthia. Some went to Italy. The Jewish Encyclopedia records that most Styrian Jews emigrated to Italy, crossing the Alps into territories with different rulers and different policies. But many stayed closer. Maximilian, despite the perpetual nature of the expulsion, allowed Jews to settle in border towns that technically lay outside the expelled territories. Eisenstadt, Marchegg, Sistersdorf, Kobersdorf, Greens, known today as Koscheg. These towns sat on the Austrian-Hungarian frontier, but legally ambiguous spaces where the emperor could maintain Jewish tax revenue without technically violating his deal with the estates. These settlements eventually became the famous 7 communities of Burgenland: Eisenstadt, Mattersburg, Kobersdorf, Lachenbach, Deutschkreuz, Frauenkirchen, Kitze. From the 1620s onward, under the protection of the Esterhazy family, these communities would flourish. Jews there even received special privileges, including exemption from the requirement to wear distinguishing clothes. The expelled built new lives just miles from their old ones. Close enough to remember, close enough to see the church steeples of towns where their grandparents had lived. Far enough to be safe. One family's trajectory captures the entire arc of displacement. Jews expelled from Maribor took the surname Morpurgo, derived from the German name for their city, Marburg. That name would become prominent in Trieste and Split. Today, over 2,300 people appear on Morpurgo family trees, a living genealogical monument to the 1496 expulsion. Every Morpurgo carries in their name the memory of a place their ancestors were forced to leave. And then there's the exception that proves the rule. Maximilian, the emperor who sold the Jews of 2 provinces for 42,000 florins, kept one Jew close. His name was Hirschel of Sistersdorf, sometimes called Hirschel of Graz. Why? Because the emperor was so much in his debt. On May 24, 1518, Hirschel was formally exempted from the general ban and permitted to reside in Vienna. While thousands remained in permanent exile, this one man received a personal exemption because the emperor owed him money and needed his services. Funer's scholarly study devotes an entire chapter to this relationship. Hirschel represents the beginning of the era of court Jews in Austria, the paradox of rulers who expelled entire communities while keeping individual Jews close because they couldn't afford not to. The message was clear. Jews as a community were disposable, but a useful Jew, a wealthy Jew, a Jew who could solve the emperor's financial problems, that Jew could stay. Loyalty to the community counted for nothing. Individual value to the ruler counted for everything. What did the expulsion accomplish? What did the estates get for their 42,000 florins? In the short term, they got rid of their creditors. They got Jewish property at confiscation prices. They got the satisfaction of seeing an unpopular minority removed from their midst. In the longer term, the results were more complicated. The removal of the primary credit source created a vacuum. Christian bankers stepped in. The Fuggers extended their reach. Italian Lombard bankers found new markets. The debt didn't disappear. Only the creditors changed, and some observers noticed that things weren't actually better. Abbot Rumpler of Formbach complained in 1504 that his revenues in Neunkirchen had been higher when Jews were still there. The expelled Jews had been economic actors. They had bought goods. They had paid taxes. They had made loans that enabled other economic activity. Remove them, and the economy shrank. The historian Rowan Doran, in his prize-winning book No Return, published by Princeton in 2023, demonstrates that the distinction between Jewish usurers and Christian bankers was often artificial and politically constructed. Christian lenders charged interest too. They just called it different things: fees, commissions, premiums. The sin of usury was elastic, expanding to cover Jewish lending and contracting to excuse Christian finance. The real achievement of the expulsion was not economic improvement. It was ethnic homogeneity. The estates had paid 42,000 florins to make their territories Judenfrei, free of Jews. They would remain that way for nearly 4 centuries. Now, I want to tell you something that might challenge what you think you know about this story. Because so far, I've been describing Jews primarily as victims. And they were victims. There's no getting around that. But people are complicated. Communities are complicated. And honest history requires us to look at all sides, even when it's uncomfortable. The accusations in the expulsion decree were false. Blood libel was fabricated. Host desecration charges were nonsense. But were there no legitimate grievances against individual Jews? Were there no practices that genuinely harmed Christian borrowers? The historical record suggests the picture was mixed. Interest rates of 30 to 43% were standard across Central Europe. I explained earlier why these rates reflected risk, but explaining why something happens doesn't mean the people affected by it felt good about it. A farmer who borrowed money to survive a bad harvest and then watched his debt double in 2 years experienced real suffering. That suffering was real, even if the system that caused it was created by Christians who banned other forms of credit. Some Jewish lenders were aggressive in collecting debts. Some foreclosed on collateral in ways that destroyed families. Some charged penalties that compounded already crushing burdens. These weren't all of them, probably not even most of them, but they existed. Within Jewish communities, there were internal conflicts that sometimes spilled into the Christian world. Disputes over inheritance, rivalries between families, cases where Jews provided testimony against other Jews in Christian courts. There's a case from 1489 documented in the records where a woman named Gutel, the widow of a merchant from Judenberg, conducted a court case before a mixed Jewish-Christian court in Marburg without a legal representative. She won control over her debtor's property. This tells us something about the complexity of these communities. Jewish women could be creditors. Jewish creditors pursued cases in mixed courts. The boundaries between Jewish and Christian legal worlds were more porous than we might assume. The point isn't to justify the expulsion. Nothing justifies ethnic cleansing. Nothing justifies making an entire people pay for the actions of individuals. The Christian merchants who competed with Jewish merchants weren't collectively punished for the sins of individual cheaters among them. The nobles who defaulted on loans weren't collectively expelled for their unreliability as borrowers. The point is that the people being expelled were people, not saints, not demons. People with all the virtues and vices that people have. Their humanity makes the injustice clearer, not fuzzier. Expelling complex human beings with mixed records is exactly as wrong as expelling innocents, because collective punishment is wrong, period. The estates who pushed for expulsion weren't thinking about individual cases anyway. They had economic motives, dressed in religious language. The specific behaviors of specific Jews mattered less than the opportunity to be rid of all of them. The ban on Jewish settlement in Styria and Carinthia proved remarkably durable. In 1783, Emperor Joseph II proclaimed his famous Toleration Act, extending new rights to non-Catholics throughout the Habsburg domains. The Styrian deputies formally protested. The emperor confirmed that Jews neither exist nor are tolerated in this country. Nearly 3 centuries after the original expulsion, the ban held firm. The edict was renewed in 1797, again in 1819, again in 1823, again in 1828. Each renewal was a statement. Each renewal said, "We remember what we decided in 1496, and we stand by it." Only after the Revolution of 1848 did legal equality finally arrive. The imperial patent of March 4, 1849, granted Jews equal rights. But even then, the reality lagged behind the law. Jews could initially only stay in Graz, while officially traveling through. Residence remained restricted. The Graz Jewish community was not formally re-established until 1869. That's 373 years after the expulsion. Longer than the United States has existed. Longer than almost any other medieval expulsion ban survived. When Jews finally returned to Styria in the 19th century, they found a landscape scattered with memory. Judenberg with its coat of arms, or the Judenhurl Gate. Place names like Judendorf, Judenanger, Judengraben. Streets and villages named for people who had been forced out 4 centuries earlier. In Maribor, the synagogue still stood, repurposed and transformed, but structurally intact. In 1994, the building was acquired by the Cultural Center of Maribor. It's now a venue for exhibitions and concerts. The oldest synagogue in Slovenia, a monument to absence, a space that remembers what was taken. There's a broader pattern here, and it's worth stepping back to see it. The 1496 expulsion wasn't unique. It was part of a wave of expulsions that swept across late medieval Europe. England expelled its Jews in 1290. France followed in 1306. Spain in 1492, just 4 years before Maximilian's decree. Portugal in 1497. What drove this wave? Not religion alone, not economics alone. A combination that modern scholars are only now fully understanding. Keres Doten-Snitker, a historian at Cambridge, analyzed 118 expulsions across 814 cities for her doctoral research. Her findings challenged simple explanations. The cause of expulsion wasn't Jewish behavior. It was fault lines among Christians. Specifically, 2 processes were at work. First, territorialization, the consolidation of political authority in the hands of princes and rulers who sought to unify their domains. Second, religious reform, including movements that placed new emphasis on rulers' responsibility for the spiritual welfare of their subjects. Put these together and you get a toxic combination. Rulers who felt pressure to demonstrate their Christian piety. Rulers who were centralizing power and defining who belonged within their territories. Or rulers who could trade Jewish protection for political support from estates and cities. And yet, crucially, most cities did not expel their Jews. Out of 814 cities Doten Snitker studied, only 118 carried out expulsions. The majority found ways to keep their Jewish communities, whether out of economic interest, genuine tolerance, or simple inertia. This makes the places that did expel more interesting, not less. It means we can ask what was different about them, what made Styria and Corinthia particular targets. Part of the answer lies in the specific political configuration. The provincial estates were strong. The emperor was weak. The estates had a grievance, debt to Jewish creditors, and a remedy, expulsion. The emperor had a need, cash for wars, and a price, 42,000 florins. Part of the answer lies in the recent history of blood libel accusations. The Trent Affair of 1475 had reactivated the machinery of accusation and persecution. Simon of Trent's alleged martyrdom provided fresh ammunition for those who wanted Jews removed. Part of the answer lies in the personality of Frederick III and the transition to Maximilian. Frederick had protected Jews consistently for decades. His death removed the single most significant obstacle to expulsion. And part of the answer lies in the simple fact that the expelled had no defenders. No faction within the estates argued for keeping the Jews. No power broker saw advantage in opposing the expulsion. No voice spoke up effectively when the decrees were being negotiated. The Jews of Styria and Corinthia were alone, and they lost. I want to return to where we started, to that Jewish family packing their carts in the spring of 1496. We don't know their names. The records preserve some individuals, rabbis and merchants and widows who appear in legal documents, but not the ordinary families who made up the bulk of the expelled. We know they had to leave behind graves. Jewish tradition requires perpetual care for the dead. The cemeteries at Friesach and Graz and Maribor held generations of ancestors. Leaving meant abandoning them to an uncertain fate. We know they had to sell property at terrible prices. When everyone knows you're forced to sell, no one pays fair value. The Christians who bought Jewish homes and shops in 1496 and 1497 got bargains that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. We know they faced uncertainty about where to go. Italy was far. The border towns were unknown quantities. Some families had contacts in other communities. Others were starting from scratch. We know that some of them, perhaps many of them, never recovered. Displacement is traumatic. Economic loss is traumatic. Watching your community dissolve, watching the synagogue where your children were named become a church, watching your neighbors divide up your possessions. These are traumas that mark generations. And we know that they survived. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to establish new communities in Burgenland. Enough to scatter across Italy and eventually across the world. Enough to preserve the memory of what was lost. The Morpurgos carry Maribor in their name. Other families carry other memories. The expulsion created a diaspora within the diaspora, scattering Styrian and Corinthian Jews across a wider world that already contained centuries of previous dispersions. There's a final irony to this story. After 1510, Maximilian stopped authorizing expulsions. The man who had sold the Jews of Styria and Corinthia, the man who had signed 13 expulsion decrees between 1494 and 1510, apparently concluded that the practice wasn't worth it. Stable Jewish communities paying regular taxes generated more revenue than one-time expulsion fees. The 42,000 florins from Styria and Corinthia were spent on wars that didn't resolve anything. The Lombard and Christian bankers who replaced Jewish lenders charged just as much and proved just as unpopular. Maximilian, the pragmatist, the man motivated entirely by financial considerations, looked at the results of his own policies and decided to stop. Too late for the Jews of Styria and Corinthia, but perhaps not too late to learn something from the calculation. Expulsion was sold as a solution. It was supposed to purify the territories of a dangerous element. It was supposed to free Christians from the burden of Jewish usury. It was supposed to protect communities from ritual murder and host desecration. It accomplished none of these things. The dangers were imaginary to begin with. The economic problems persisted under new management. The territories gained nothing but empty synagogues and abandoned cemeteries. What the estates bought for 42,000 florins was not a solution. It was a gesture, a very expensive gesture that made them feel better about problems that remained unsolved. This is the lesson of 1496. If there is a lesson, persecution doesn't work. It doesn't solve the problems it claims to address. It generates suffering, it destroys wealth, it scatters communities, and it leaves behind only absence. The street names, remember: Judenberg, Judengasse, Judendorf. The map of Styria and Carinthia is inscribed with the names of people who were forced to leave. You can walk through towns today and read the history and the place names if you know how to read. The buildings, remember: the Maribor Synagogue, converted, repurposed, but still standing. The foundations in Graz, where archaeologists occasionally find fragments of Jewish life, the shapes of medieval quarters that outlast the people who lived in them. And the families, remember: the Morpurgos and all the others who carry the names of lost places, scattered across continents. They preserve in their genealogies the fact that their ancestors once lived in the Alpine foothills, once prayed in synagogues that faced Jerusalem, once buried their dead in cemeteries on hillsides, once thought they had found a home. They were wrong about the last part. You cannot find a permanent home in a place where your presence depends on the goodwill of rulers who might sell you to the highest bidder. The Jews of Styria and Carinthia learned this lesson in 1496. Other communities would learn it later, in other places, under other circumstances. But the longing for home persists. The memory of home persists. And sometimes, centuries later, the possibility of return. In 1869, when the Graz Jewish community was finally re-established, the congregants faced a choice. They could treat their presence as something new, a fresh start disconnected from the past, or they could claim continuity with the community that had existed before 1496. They chose continuity. They chose to see themselves as the heirs of the expelled, returning after a very long absence to reclaim something that had been taken. This was partly symbolic. No direct lineages connected the new community to the old. The people who returned in the 19th century were not descendants of the people who had left in the 15th. They came from different places with different histories, but they came to the same place. They established a synagogue in the same city. They buried their dead in ground that had held Jewish graves before. They became part of a story that stretched back before the expulsion and forward into whatever future awaited. That future included its own catastrophe. The 20th century would bring horrors that made the 1496 expulsion look almost gentle by comparison. The Graz synagogue was destroyed on Kristallnacht in 1938. The community that had taken 373 years to re-establish was annihilated in less than a decade. But that's another story for another time. An emperor needed money. Provincial estates offered to pay. The price was the Jews. The deal was done. 4 centuries of presence, 4 centuries of building synagogues and establishing schools and burying the dead and teaching the living, all of it erased in a bureaucratic transaction. 42,000 florins. That was the price of protection. That was the value placed on communities that had shaped the economic and intellectual life of these territories for longer than most families could trace their lineage. We remember the names: Graz, Judenberg, Maribor, Klagenfurt, Völkermarkt, Friesach. We remember what was lost: the synagogues, the schools, the traditions, the knowledge, the potential. We remember the people who made the deal: Maximilian the Moneyless, who sold his Jews because he needed cash; the estates of Styria and Carinthia, who paid for ethnic cleansing because it served their interests. And we remember the people who had no voice in the negotiation: the families packing their carts, the scholars closing their books, the children being carried away from the only home they knew. They didn't choose to leave. The choice was made for them by people who had the power to decide and the willingness to use it. This is what happened in 1496. This is what expulsion looks like when you strip away the accusations and the justifications and the legal language and look at what actually occurred. An emperor sold his Jews. The estates bought them gone, and the expelled carried their memories into exile, across the Alps and across the centuries, waiting for the day when someone would tell their story. Let me tell you about the church's role because we haven't fully examined it yet. The bishops of Styria and Carinthia weren't passive observers. They sat in the estates as members of the clerical order. They participated in the assemblies that voted for expulsion. They contributed to the funds that paid Maximilian. This wasn't reluctant participation. The church had been demanding action against Jews for decades. The Council of Basel in the 1430s had called for strict enforcement of discriminatory legislation. Local synods had demanded an end to Jewish usury. Preachers had stirred up popular hatred with tales of ritual murder and host desecration. The Franciscans were particularly active. John of Capistrano in the 1450s, Bernardino da Feltre in the 1470s. These were not fringe figures. They were respected churchmen, celebrated for their piety, renowned for their preaching. When they called for action against Jews, they spoke with the authority of the church. The secular clergy joined in. Parish priests told their congregations about Jewish crimes. Cathedral canons lobbied the estates for expulsion. Abbots and priors complained about Jewish usury undermining church revenues. And yet, the same church also produced Pope Nicholas V's bull of 1451, explicitly permitting Emperor Frederick to keep Jews in his territories. The same church had issued repeated condemnations of blood libel accusations, declaring them unfounded and forbidding their use. The church was not monolithic. It contained voices demanding persecution and voices calling for restraint. In Styria and Carinthia in 1496, the voices demanding persecution won. Why did they win here and not elsewhere? Part of the answer lies in the specific balance of power within the local church. The bishops of Graz and Klagenfurt were integrated into the estate system. Their interests aligned with the noble families who owed money to Jews. They had political reasons to support expulsion beyond their theological objections to Jewish presence. Part of the answer lies in the absence of countervailing forces. No cardinal intervened to protect the Jews. No papal legate arrived to enforce the decrees condemning blood libel. The Pope was far away in Rome, occupied with Italian politics. The local church had a free hand, and part of the answer lies in the Franciscan influence that had been building for half a century. The order had made anti-Jewish preaching a specialty. Their friars traveled constantly, spreading the same message across the German-speaking lands. By 1496, a generation had grown up hearing Franciscan denunciations of Jewish wickedness. The theological groundwork had been laid. Let me tell you about a specific family that we can trace through the records. In Judenburg, there lived a merchant named Moshe. We don't have his family name, only his given name, and his city. He appears in documents from the 1480s as a creditor to local nobles, a dealer in textiles, a man of sufficient means to contribute significantly to communal taxes. Moshe had a wife and children. Their names don't survive. He had a house in the Jewish quarter, probably inherited from his father, or purchased with the profits of trade. He had business contacts in Venice and Vienna, the normal connections of an Alpine merchant linking Italian markets to Central European consumers. When the expulsion came, Moshe faced impossible choices. His business depended on relationships built over decades. His clients were local, accustomed to dealing with him, trusting his judgment on textile quality and his fairness in pricing. Leave Judenburg, and those relationships evaporated. Start over somewhere else, and you start as a stranger with no reputation. His debts to him were substantial. Nobles who had bought on credit, smaller merchants who had taken loans to fund their own ventures. The commissions that processed these debts would not be friendly to a departing Jew trying to collect what he was owed. His property was worth something, but not what he had paid for it. fire sale prices prevailed when everyone knew you had to sell. The Christians who bought his house, his warehouse, his goods, they knew he had no leverage. They offered what they wanted to offer. He could accept or leave with nothing. And his family, children who had known only Judenberg, a wife whose friends and relatives were all in this community, elderly parents who could barely travel, whose graves would be left behind to whatever fate awaited abandoned cemeteries. We don't know what Moshe did. The records don't follow him past the expulsion. Maybe he went to Venice, where he had contacts. Maybe he settled in one of the border towns, hoping to maintain some connection to his former life. Maybe he died on the journey, an old man unable to survive the trauma of displacement. His story is not unique. It's the story of every family expelled. The specific details vary, but the pattern is the same. Lives built over decades, destroyed in months. Wealth accumulated over generations, confiscated in weeks. Communities that thought they were permanent, erased as if they had never existed. Let me tell you about what we might call the bystanders. The Christians who neither supported nor opposed the expulsion. The ones who just watched. Medieval society was full of such people. Most peasants had no political voice. Most townspeople followed the lead of their betters. Most clergy deferred to their bishops. When the estates voted for expulsion, the great majority of the population had no say in the matter. But they saw what happened. They watched their Jewish neighbors packing carts. They bought goods at fire sale prices. They moved into vacated houses. They attended the newly converted churches that had once been synagogues. What did they feel? Guilt? Relief? Indifference? We have almost no records of bystander reactions. The chroniclers who documented the expulsion were either hostile to Jews or simply uninterested in recording dissent. Any Christians who objected did so quietly, leaving no trace in the written record. But we can infer something from the sheer normality of life after expulsion. The markets kept operating. The churches held their services. The fields were plowed and harvested. Life went on. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of atrocity, not the perpetrators, whose guilt is clear, but the bystanders, whose acceptance makes it possible. A society that can absorb the expulsion of its neighbors without significant disruption is a society that has accommodated itself to injustice. The estates could not have expelled the Jews if the broader population had risen in opposition. The emperor could not have signed the decrees if doing so would have provoked rebellion. Expulsion required not just active perpetrators, but passive acceptance from everyone else. That passive acceptance came easily. The Jews were strangers despite centuries of presence. They worshiped differently. They dressed differently. They spoke a language among themselves that Christians didn't understand. The propaganda of blood libel and host desecration had made them seem dangerous rather than merely different. When the order came to expel them, the population shrugged. Not our problem. Maybe they deserve it. Either way, nothing to do with us. This is how atrocities happen. Not through universal enthusiasm for evil, but through widespread indifference to injustice. The perpetrators do the deed. The bystanders let it happen. Together, they make the world that follows. Let me tell you about the investigative angle I mentioned we would explore. Historians have long wondered whether the accusations against Jews had any factual basis whatsoever. Not the blood libels, which were demonstrably false, but the charges of economic misconduct. Were Jewish lenders actually more predatory than their circumstances required? The evidence is mixed, as you would expect with any large group over a long period. We have documented cases of Jewish lenders charging extraordinarily high rates, well above the standard 30 to 43%. We have cases of aggressive debt collection, where creditors used every legal mechanism to extract payment from struggling debtors. We have cases of fraud, where altered documents or misrepresented terms cheated borrowers out of money. But we have similar cases involving Christian lenders. Lombard bankers charged high rates, too. Local Christian pawnbrokers were just as aggressive as their Jewish competitors. Fraud occurred across religious lines. The difference was accountability. When a Christian lender behaved badly, he faced consequences as an individual. His coreligionists weren't blamed for his conduct. His entire community wasn't expelled because of his actions. When a Jewish lender behaved badly, the entire community bore responsibility. One instance of fraud became evidence of Jewish perfidy. One case of excessive interest became proof that all Jewish lending was usurious. The collective guilt that was never applied to Christians was always applied to Jews. This double standard made accusations self-fulfilling. You couldn't prove that Jewish lenders were worse than Christian lenders because you weren't comparing them fairly. You were holding Jews to standards that Christians were never required to meet. The investigative conclusion is therefore unsatisfying but important. Yes, some Jewish lenders behaved badly. So did some Christian lenders. The expulsion was not based on any fair assessment of conduct. It was based on collective punishment for individual actions that would never have triggered collective punishment if the actors had been Christian. But were there any documents that survived? The expulsion decree itself was published in the Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums in 1849. The newspaper was founded by Jewish editors seeking to document their people's history. They reprinted the 1496 decree as evidence of what their ancestors had suffered. Reading it today, the language is strikingly bureaucratic. After the inflammatory accusations in the preamble, the actual orders are dry and procedural. Jews are to leave by such a date. Their property is to be handled in such a way. Commissions will be established to settle debts. This is the language of administration, not passion. David Herzog's collection, published in Graz in 1934, gathered the primary sources for Styrian Jewish history from 1475 to 1558. The timing is poignant. Herzog was documenting the expulsion of 1496 just as the conditions for a far worse persecution were developing. Within 4 years of his publication, Austria would be annexed by Nazi Germany. The remnants of Styrian Jewry that had rebuilt since 1869 would be destroyed. Peter Rauscher and Barbara Staudinger's collection, published in 2011, covers the post-expulsion period, documenting the traces of Jewish activity in territories that technically had no Jews. These documents show that the expulsion was never complete. Jews continued to pass through. Jews continued to do business. The border was more porous than the decree suggested. The archives of the Institut für Jüdische Geschichte Österreichs in St. Pölten contain ongoing research on medieval Austrian Jewish history. Evelyn Brugger's massive project documenting every medieval document relating to Austrian Jews has already published 5 volumes and continues to expand. New sources emerge as archives are cataloged and digitized. What these documents tell us, collectively, is that the expelled communities left traces. Not enough to reconstruct individual lives in detail, but enough to establish the outlines of what was lost, the lists of taxpayers, the records of loans, the legal cases that went to court, the mentions in Christian chronicles that happened to note Jewish presence. From these fragments, historians piece together a picture of communities that were real, substantial, integrated into the economic and legal fabric of their territories. Not the monstrous strangers of persecution propaganda, but ordinary people doing ordinary things until they were driven out. The 373-year exclusion of Jews from Styria and Carinthia was one of the longest in European history. Other territories expelled their Jews and readmitted them decades or generations later. Styria maintained the ban through the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution. Why so long? Why did the ban persist when so much else changed? Part of the answer is institutional inertia. The expulsion was written into the legal framework of the territory. Each new ruler confirmed the existing laws. Each estate assembly reaffirmed the ban when Jews tried to return. The default position was exclusion, and changing the default required political effort that no one was willing to expend. Part of the answer is economic interest. The Christian merchants and financiers who had replaced Jewish lenders had no desire to face competition. They lobbied to maintain the ban because exclusion served their business interests. Part of the answer is religious conviction. The Counter-Reformation strengthened Catholic identity in the Habsburg lands. Jews were seen as religious enemies whose presence contaminated Christian society. The same theological arguments that had justified expulsion in 1496 continued to justify exclusion for centuries afterward. And part of the answer is simple prejudice. Generation after generation grew up without encountering actual Jews. The only Jews they knew were characters in hostile stories, the villains of passion plays, the monsters of blood libel legends. Without real Jews to complicate the stereotype hardened into common sense. When Emperor Joseph II proclaimed his Toleration Act in 1781, he was trying to modernize the Habsburg Empire. He wanted to integrate non-Catholics into economic and civic life. He removed some restrictions on Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and Jews. The Styrian estates protested. They reminded the emperor that Jews neither exist nor are tolerated in this country. They demanded an exception to the general policy of toleration. The emperor, whose reforms were facing resistance on many fronts, granted the exception. Styria remained judenfrei. It took the Revolution of 1848 to break the impasse. The liberal moment that swept across Europe demanded equality before the law. The imperial patent of March 4, 1849, granted Jews equal rights throughout the Habsburg domains. This time, no exception was made for Styria. But legal equality came slowly. Jews returning to Graz faced restrictions on settlement. They could stay while traveling through, a fiction that allowed gradual immigration without acknowledging that immigration was happening. Only in 1869, 20 years after formal emancipation, was the Graz Jewish community officially re-established. That community would grow and flourish for 70 years. Then, in 1938, the pattern would repeat. Kristallnacht, expulsion, annihilation. The brief flourishing of 1869 to 1938 would prove just as vulnerable as the longer flourishing of 1100 to 1496. Historical records are mostly transactional. They record births and deaths, purchases and sales, lawsuits and judgments. They rarely record feelings. The grief of a mother forced to leave the grave of her child, the fear of a merchant watching his life's work confiscated, the confusion of a child who doesn't understand why they have to go. But we can imagine, we can extrapolate from later testimonies, from other expulsions that are better documented, from the universal human responses to displacement. There was probably denial at first. When the decree was announced, many must have assumed it wouldn't really happen. There had been threats before. There had been negotiations. Somehow things always worked out. The emperor needed Jewish taxes. The creditors needed Jewish loans. Surely reason would prevail. Then came the realization. This time was different. Frederick was dead. Maximilian had taken the money. The estates had achieved their goal. This was actually happening. Then came the scramble, selling property before it was confiscated, collecting debts before the commissions made collection impossible, deciding where to go, arranging transportation for families, goods, sacred objects. Then came the departure, walking out of the city gate, knowing you would never return, passing the landmarks of your life for the last time, the synagogue where you were married, the cemetery where your parents lay, the house where your children were born. Then came the journey, the uncertainty of the road, the fear of bandits, of hostile villages, of weather turning bad, the desperate hope that wherever you ended up would be better than this. Then came arrival, a strange place with strange customs, finding lodging, finding work, building relationships from nothing, establishing trust in a community that had no reason to trust you. Then came the long adjustment, learning to live without what you had known, creating new routines, raising children who would have no memories of the old home, becoming, gradually, someone from somewhere else. And always, the memory. The stories told at holiday tables, the names of places that no longer had Jews, the sense of belonging to a history of displacement, one more chapter in a story that stretched back to Egypt and Babylon and would stretch forward to wherever fate led next. This is what expulsion meant for the people who lived it. Not numbers in a document, not categories in a decree, but lives disrupted, families scattered, communities destroyed. Every statistic is a story. Every data point is a human being. Remember that when you hear about expulsions, or ancient or modern, remember that behind every number is a person who didn't choose to leave, who didn't want to go, who carried the weight of loss for the rest of their life. Let me tell you about what the Synagogue of Maribor means today. I mentioned earlier that the building survives, but I haven't told you what happens inside it now. The synagogue hosts exhibitions about Jewish history, not just local history, but the broader story of Jewish presence and absence in Central Europe. Visitors come to learn about communities they never knew existed, communities that were erased so completely that even their existence was forgotten. The synagogue hosts concerts. Musicians perform in a space that was built for worship, that was converted for worship of a different kind, that now serves the worship of art. The acoustics are good. The medieval builders knew what they were doing. The synagogue hosts educational programs. School children visit to learn about the history of their region, a history that includes the removal of people who lived there for centuries. For many of these children, this is their first encounter with the concept of expulsion, their first realization that communities can be destroyed by political decision. The synagogue stands as a monument, not a monument to triumph, but a monument to loss, not a monument to the glory of the builders, but a monument to the injustice visited upon them. There are no Jews in Maribor today. The community expelled in 1496 never returned. The Holocaust ensured that there would be no return. The building serves memory in the absence of the people it was built for, and yet the building endures. The walls that Jewish masons raised 6 centuries ago still stand. The space that Jewish worshippers filled with prayer still holds gatherings, different now, but continuous in some sense. The building outlasted the persecution. This is not victory. The expelled would rather have stayed, would rather have passed the synagogue to their children and grandchildren, would rather have never become a monument to loss. But it is something. It is survival of a kind. The stones remember when the people cannot. The human texture of these communities, the daily rhythms of their lives, the relationships they built, and the tensions they navigated. All of this matters for understanding what was actually lost. Let me tell you about the Jewish quarter of Maribor in the decades before the expulsion. The quarter sat near the Drava River, bounded by what is now Żydowska Ulica, Jewish Street. The synagogue anchored one end. The mikveh stood near the river, where flowing water could feed the ritual bath. Houses clustered along narrow lanes, some belonging to merchants, others to craftsmen working in trades where Jews were permitted. Rabbi Iserline's student Joseph Ben Moses left us descriptions of daily life in communities like this one. Morning prayers began before dawn. Men gathered in the synagogue while women prayed at home or in the women's section. The service followed patterns established over centuries, the same psalms, the same blessings, the same orientation toward Jerusalem that connected this small community in the Alps to the temple that had been destroyed 14 centuries earlier. After prayers came work. The merchants opened their counting houses. The moneylenders received clients. The women managed households, supervised servants, negotiated with suppliers. Children went to school where they learned Hebrew and Torah and Talmud alongside arithmetic and whatever vernacular skills they needed for commerce. The children matter here. Every community expelled is a community of children uprooted. We tend to think of medieval Jewish communities as composed of bearded scholars and shrewd merchants, the stereotypes that survive in hostile sources. But communities reproduce. They have babies. They educate the young. They plan for futures they will not live to see. The children of Maribor in 1496 were learning trades their fathers practiced. They were studying texts their grandfathers had studied. They were forming friendships and rivalries that they expected to continue for decades. They had no idea that within months, everything would change. I think about those children when I read the expulsion decrees. The documents are cold, legal, administrative. They speak of Jews as a category, a problem to be solved, a population to be removed. They do not speak of children learning their letters, of teenagers preparing for marriage, of young men taking their first steps into adult responsibility. But those children were real. And when the carts rolled out of Maribor in early 1497, children were on them, watching the only world they knew recede behind them. Let me tell you about the economics in more detail, because money was at the center of everything. A typical loan in 15th century Styria worked like this. A borrower, let's say a minor noble who needed to equip soldiers for the emperor's campaign, would approach a Jewish moneylender. The lender would assess the borrower's creditworthiness, looking at land holdings, income streams, reputation. If the lender agreed to make the loan, he would provide cash, typically silver coins, in exchange for a written agreement. The agreement specified the principal, the interest rate, the repayment schedule, and the collateral. Collateral was crucial. Because Jewish lenders had limited legal recourse against defaulting borrowers, they required physical pledges, silver cups, jewelry, sometimes documents proving ownership of land, though Jews could not actually take possession of land if the borrower defaulted. The pledges were stored in the lender's house. This created a kind of informal pawn shop system. If you walked into a Jewish moneylender's home in Graz or Judenburg, you might find chests full of aristocratic silverware, church plate that clergy had quietly pawned, merchants' goods held against outstanding balances. When the expulsion came, Jews were required to surrender these pledges before departing. Think about what this meant. You had lent money in good faith. Your borrower had given you his grandmother's silver as security. Now you were being told to give back the silver without necessarily receiving repayment of the loan. This was not debt settlement. This was debt forgiveness, imposed on the creditor at sword point. The commissions established to handle these matters were staffed by representatives of the estates, the same estates that had paid for the expulsion, the same estates whose members owed money to the Jews being expelled. Imagine being a Jewish creditor appearing before such a commission. Your debtor sits on the commission. He helped draft the expulsion order. He contributed money to make you leave. And now he is the one deciding whether you get repaid before you go. The outcome was predictable. Some debts were paid, probably those owed by people who had nothing to do with the expulsion process. Many debts were reduced, restructured, or simply canceled. The debtors used the expulsion as leverage. Pay me to leave quietly, or I'll make the process difficult. Reduce what you owe me, or I'll claim assets you don't want to give up. This was the dirty secret at the heart of the expulsion. It wasn't about blood libels or host desecration. Those were pretexts, useful for popular consumption, irrelevant to the actual negotiations. When it was about debt relief for the political class, the estates paid 42,000 florins to the emperor, but the total debt owed by estate members to Jewish creditors was almost certainly larger. The expulsion was an investment. Pay Maximilian a lump sum, and you might recover far more than that in canceled or reduced debts. This is why the estates were willing to pay so much. This is why they had been demanding expulsion for decades. Every year that the Jews stayed, interest accumulated. Every year that Frederick refused, the debts grew larger. When Maximilian finally agreed to sell, the estates moved fast, before anyone could change their minds. Not all Christians wanted the Jews expelled. Not all Christians hated their Jewish neighbors. The sources are mostly hostile, written by people who supported the expulsion, or at least accepted it. But traces of other attitudes survive. There were Christian merchants who had done business with Jews for years. Partnerships where a Christian handled the parts of commerce that Jews were barred from, and a Jew handled the credit and financing. These relationships were disrupted by the expulsion. Some Christian merchants lost valued business partners. There were Christian servants who worked in Jewish households. Medieval Jewish families in these territories employed Christian women as domestic help, Christian men as manual laborers. These employees lost their jobs when the expulsion came. Some had worked for the same family for decades. They were Christian neighbors who had grown accustomed to the Jewish presence. The Jewish quarter wasn't a ghetto in the later sense. It was a neighborhood where Jews lived. But Christians passed through regularly. Business was conducted. Conversations happened. Not friendships exactly, the social barriers were too high for that, but familiarity, coexistence. When the Jews left, these Christians had to make sense of the absence. Some were probably relieved. Others may have felt guilt, or at least discomfort. The official narrative said the Jews were dangerous enemies who had been removed for the community's protection. But if you had known actual Jews, if you had bought goods from them or worked in their houses or simply nodded to them in the street, the official narrative might not have matched your experience. We don't have diaries from these people. We don't know what they thought. But we know they existed. The expulsion wasn't just an event that happened to Jews. It was an event that happened to communities, and communities included everyone who lived in them. I said earlier that Maximilian didn't believe the accusations in his own decree. That's true. He was a pragmatist operating in transactional mode. But the estates who demanded expulsion weren't all cynical manipulators. Some of them genuinely believed that Jews were dangerous. Some of them genuinely feared the Jewish presence put Christian souls at risk. Some of them genuinely thought they were doing God's work. The late 15th century was a time of intense religious anxiety across Europe. The Ottoman threat felt apocalyptic to many Christians. The Portuguese were rounding Africa, opening new routes that seemed to fulfill prophecies. Columbus had just reached what he thought was the edge of Asia. The world was changing in ways that felt eschatological. In this atmosphere, religious purity movements gained strength. John of Capistrano's preaching in the 1450s had primed communities to see Jews as existential threats. Bernardino da Feltre's sermons in the 1470s had produced the Trent blood libel. By the 1490s, a generation had grown up hearing that Jews murdered children, that Jews desecrated the host, that Jews were agents of the devil working to destroy Christendom. These beliefs were false. They were propaganda, manufactured by people who had their own motives for stirring up hatred. But the people who believed them were not always cynical. Some truly thought they were fighting evil. This doesn't excuse anything. Sincere hatred is still hatred. Sincere persecution is still persecution. The victims of true believers suffer just as much as the victims of cynical manipulators. But understanding the mental world of the persecutors helps us see how this could happen. It wasn't a case of obviously evil people doing obviously evil things. It was a case of people acting within a framework that made their actions seem righteous. They were defending Christianity. They were protecting children. They were purifying their land. The framework was wrong. The assumptions were false. The actions were unjust. But the people taking them didn't necessarily experience them that way. They experienced them as virtue. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the story. Not the evil that knew itself as evil, but the evil that thought itself good. But what happened to the synagogues? The physical structures of Jewish life were among the most permanent legacies of the communities. Buildings outlast people. Stones outlast memories. The synagogues of Styria and Carinthia, built over centuries, didn't simply vanish when the Jews left. In Maribor, I mentioned that Bernard and Drucker converted the synagogue into a church. The building was well constructed, with thick walls and good foundations. It had been a house of prayer for Jews. Now it would be a house of prayer for Christians. The conversion required removing specifically Jewish elements. The Aron HaKodesh, the ark where Torah scrolls were stored, was taken out. The bima, the raised platform for reading Torah, was removed. The menorah and Ner Tamid were gone. In their place went an altar, a crucifix, Christian images. But the orientation remained. The building still faced east, toward Jerusalem. A Christian worshiping in the Church of All Saints was facing the same direction that Jews had faced for over a century. The architecture remembered what the congregation tried to forget. Other synagogues met different fates. Some were demolished, their stones reused in other construction. Some were converted into warehouses or private homes. Some simply deteriorated, abandoned and neglected until they collapsed. The cemeteries were particularly vulnerable. Jewish tradition requires that graves remain undisturbed forever, but once the community that maintained the cemetery was gone, there was no one to protect it. Some cemeteries were taken over by monastic orders who maintained them, more or less as part of their property. Others were plowed under for farmland. Others became quarries. The gravestones carted off for building material. The Hebrew inscriptions were unreadable to most Christians anyway, just strange marks on useful stone. Archaeologists today occasionally find fragments, a gravestone built into a wall, foundation stones with Hebrew letters. These fragments are all that remain of communities that thought they were building for eternity. Let me tell you about the scholarly heritage that was scattered. Rabbi Iserline's influence extended far beyond Maribor and Wiener Neustadt. His responsa circulated across the Jewish world. His students carried his teachings to new communities. His methods shaped legal reasoning for generations. But Iserline had died in 1460, 36 years before the expulsion. The scholars who carried on his tradition in the 1490s are less famous. Their names appear in documents, but their works, if they wrote any, have mostly been lost. What happens when you expel a scholarly community? The buildings can be converted. The property can be confiscated. But the knowledge walks out the door. The students who had been studying in Maribor scattered. Some may have continued their studies elsewhere. Others may have abandoned scholarship for more practical concerns, the urgent business of survival in a new place. The chain of transmission was broken. This matters because Jewish learning depends on continuity. The Talmud is not a book you can pick up and understand on your own. You need teachers who can explain the arguments, point out the assumptions, connect the legal discussions to practical situations. You need a community of scholars arguing with each other, challenging interpretations, refining understanding. When you destroy a scholarly community, you don't just displace people. You interrupt a conversation that has been going on for centuries. The next generation has to start over, reconnecting with a tradition through texts alone, without the living guidance of teachers who themselves learned from teachers. Some of this knowledge was preserved. The printed word was becoming available, and Iserline's works survived in manuscript and eventually in print. But the oral traditions, the personal teachings, the ways of understanding that were passed from teacher to student in the academies of Maribor and elsewhere, much of this was lost. We don't know what we lost. That's the nature of lost knowledge. We know Iserline's published responsa. We don't know what his successors were working on in the years before 1496. We don't know what insights were developing, what debates were ongoing, what innovations were emerging. All of that was packed into carts and scattered across Europe. Some fragments survived. Much was lost forever. But which legal mechanism made all of that possible? In medieval law, Jews existed in a peculiar status. They were not citizens in the normal sense. They were not subjects with standard rights and obligations. They were, legally speaking, property of the ruler. This sounds harsh, and it was. But it also provided a kind of protection. If Jews belonged to the emperor, then harming Jews was harming imperial property. Unauthorized violence against Jews was an offense against the ruler, not just against the victims. This is why Frederick III could protect the Jews despite popular hostility. He wasn't just being nice, he was asserting property rights. These are my Jews. You don't get to touch my Jews. But property can be sold. Property can be transferred. If the Jews belonged to the emperor, then the emperor could dispose of them as he saw fit. The estate's offer was essentially a purchase. We'll pay you 42,000 florins for your Jews, not to buy them as slaves, but to buy your permission to remove them. We're buying your property rights so that you won't assert them against us when we drive them out. Maximilian accepted the offer. He signed the decrees. He transferred his claim. The Jews ceased to be imperial property protected by imperial authority. They became simply people who had been ordered to leave, with no one to defend them. This legal framework helps explain why expulsions happened when rulers changed. Frederick III protected the Jews because he wanted to. Maximilian sold them because he needed to. The protection was never a right. It was a privilege, granted by one man and withdrawn by another. The expelled Jews understood this. That's why some of them settled in the border towns where Maximilian still retained control. As long as they remained useful to the emperor, as long as they paid taxes and provided services, they might be protected, not by law, but by interest. It was a precarious existence, but it was existence. And after 1496, precarious existence was the best available option. Let me tell you about the economic aftermath in more detail. The estates had promised that removing the Jews would solve their financial problems. No more usury. No more predatory lending. No more Jewish stranglehold on credit. What actually happened was more complicated. The demand for credit didn't disappear when the Jews left. Nobles still needed to equip soldiers. Merchants still needed to fund trading ventures. Peasants still needed to survive bad harvests. The economic functions that Jewish lenders had filled were still necessary. Into the vacuum stepped Christian bankers. The Fuggers expanded their operations. Italian Lombard bankers, who had been active in other parts of Europe, found new markets. Local Christian lenders, who had previously operated in the shadow of Jewish competition, emerged into the open. These Christian lenders charged interest too. They called it different things: transaction fees, risk premiums, discount rates. The vocabulary changed, but the substance remained. But money had a price, regardless of who was lending it. In some cases, the Christian lenders charged more than the Jews had. Competition had kept rates somewhat in check. With the Jewish lenders gone, the remaining lenders had more market power. Abbot Rumpler's complaint that his revenues were lower without the Jews reflected real economic disruption. The expelled community had been a node in economic networks that stretched across the region. They had bought goods, sold goods, moved money, facilitated trade. Remove them, and those networks had to reconfigure. Some connections were lost. Some efficiencies disappeared. The estates had traded a functioning, if imperfect, credit system for the same system operated by different people. The moral satisfaction of having expelled the Jews was real. The economic benefits were largely illusory. Historians talk about collective memory, the ways that communities remember their past. For the Jewish communities expelled from Styria and Carinthia, memory was survival. The surname Morpurgo preserved the connection to Maribor. Other families carried other markers. Place names embedded in family traditions. Stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren. The knowledge that once, before everything changed, your ancestors lived in the mountains. This memory was both painful and precious. Painful because it recorded loss. Precious because it preserved identity. To be a Morpurgo was to know that your family came from somewhere, that you belonged to a story larger than yourself, that your people had built something worth remembering, even though it had been taken away. For the communities that remained in the expelled territories, a memory worked differently. The Jewish absence became part of the landscape. The place names persisted: Judenberg, Judengasse, Judendorf. People walked through streets named for vanished neighbors without necessarily thinking about what the names meant. Occasionally someone would ask, "Why is this called Jewsboro? Why is this the Jews' Gate?" The answers, when they came, were often distorted. The Jews left because they were bad. The Jews were expelled because they did terrible things. The official narrative of the expulsion, the blood libels and host desecration charges, became local legend. For 373 years, the territory had no Jews to contradict these stories. The absence allowed the hostile narrative to solidify. When Jews finally returned in the 19th century, they encountered communities that had learned to think of Jews as historical villains. This is what expulsion does. It doesn't just remove people, it removes the possibility of encounter. Without actual Jews to complicate the stereotype becomes the only story. Let me tell you about what the scholars have learned. The study of medieval Jewish expulsions has advanced significantly in recent decades. Historians used to treat expulsions as expressions of irrational hatred, mob violence, religious fanaticism. The newer scholarship recognizes more complex dynamics. Rowan Doran's work demonstrates that expulsions were strategic decisions made by political actors for political reasons. The religious accusations were tools, not causes. The real drivers were territorial consolidation, competition over credit markets, on negotiations between rulers and estates. This doesn't make the expulsions less evil, it makes them more understandable. And understanding is necessary for prevention. If expulsions were simply outbursts of irrational hatred, then all we could do is hope for more rational times. But if expulsions were strategic decisions, then they can be anticipated, opposed, prevented. You can identify the political dynamics that make expulsion attractive. You can build institutions that raise the cost of persecution. You can create constituencies that benefit from inclusion rather than exclusion. The 1496 expulsion happened because the political calculus favored it. Maximilian needed money. The estates wanted debt relief. The Jews had no powerful advocates. Change any of these factors, and the outcome might have been different. Frederick III had changed the calculus simply by refusing to sell. One man's determination kept the communities intact for decades. When he died, the protection died with him. The lesson is that protection dependent on individual goodwill is no protection at all. Today we have laws, we have constitutions, we have international conventions. These are supposed to be more durable than the favor of kings. But laws are only as strong as the institutions that enforce them. Constitutions can be amended. International conventions can be ignored. The Jews of Styria and Carinthia had ducal privileges. They had papal bulls. They had legal frameworks that ostensibly protected them. None of it mattered when the political will to protect them evaporated. I want to end with a story about return. In the late 20th century, as Slovenia gained independence and began reckoning with its history, attention turned to the Maribor Synagogue. The building had survived wars and regime changes. It had been a church, then a warehouse, then nearly forgotten. In 1994, the Cultural Center of Maribor took possession of the building. Restoration began. Scholars examined the structure, identifying medieval elements, tracing the original layout, documenting what remained of the Jewish past. Today, the synagogue is a museum and cultural center. Exhibitions tell the story of the Jewish community that worshiped there. Concerts fill the space with music. The building serves new purposes, but it also serves memory. There's no Jewish community in Maribor today. The community that was expelled in 1496 never returned. The Holocaust destroyed any possibility of Jewish renewal in much of Central Europe. The building is a monument to absence, a memorial to people who can't be brought back. But the building stands. The walls that Jewish masons built in the 14th century still hold up the roof. The orientation toward Jerusalem still shapes the space. The architecture outlived the persecution. When I think about the 1496 expulsion, I try to hold both realities in mind. The destruction was real. Communities that had flourished for 4 centuries were erased in a single year. Families were scattered. Scholarship was interrupted. Lives were ruined. But survival was also real. The expelled built new communities elsewhere. Their descendants carried memories forward. The traditions continued, transformed but unbroken. And the stones remembered, but even when the people were gone. This is the double nature of Jewish history: catastrophe and continuity, destruction and survival. The two threads wind around each other, inseparable. The 1496 expulsion was a catastrophe. For the people who lived through it, it was the end of their world. Everything they had known, everything they had built, everything they had expected for their children, all of it was taken away. But it wasn't the end of the story. The story continued in the border towns of Burgenland. It continued in the Italian communities that received Styrian refugees. It continued in the traditions that the expelled carried with them. And the story continues today in the descendants of the expelled who still carry their ancestors' names, in the scholars who piece together the fragments of the past, in the museums that preserve what remains. The stones remember. And now you remember too. This is the story of 1496. An emperor sold his Jews. The estates bought them gone, and the expelled carried their memories into exile. 42,000 florins. That was the price. 373 years. That was the duration of the ban. But the memory lasts longer than any decree. The memory lasts as long as anyone is willing to tell the story. I've told it today. Now it belongs to you as well. Remember Graz. Remember Judenburg. Remember Maribor. Remember Klagenfurt. Remember Völkermarkt. Remember Friesach. Remember what was built there. Remember what was taken. Remember the people who had no voice when the decisions were made. And remember that this didn't have to happen. It was a choice. People chose to do this. People could have chosen differently. That's the final lesson of 1496. Persecution is not a natural disaster. It's not a force of history beyond human control. It's a decision made by human beings who could decide otherwise. The estates of Styria and Carinthia chose to pay for expulsion. They could have chosen not to. Maximilian chose to accept the money. He could have refused. They made their choices. They lived with the consequences. And we live with the consequences still, in a world shaped by decisions made 5 centuries ago by people who thought they were solving a problem. They weren't solving anything. They were just moving the problem somewhere else and pretending it was gone. If you found this history interesting, this next video will shock you. Click right here to watch it now.